All right, this works? Yeah. Okay. Thanks for showing up. We have not every director of tripping, but...
Make sure everyone speaks really into the microphone so the sound gets to the back.
All right. So we have the vast majority of directors of tripping from roughly late 1950s through the present time. And here's what we're going to attempt to do. We're allotted over an hour, I think, for this. So after they each introduce themselves, then Steve's going to explain the format of this. And then we are going to have DOTs from certain eras speak first. But we also have, eras aren't broken down necessarily by the decades, in a sense. But that's what we're going to try to do. And within one decade, there may have been 3, possibly even 4 directors of tripping. But maybe one person will take the lead in terms of explaining their perspective relative to canoe tripping during their time, which then reflects it for maybe that decade. But other directors of tripping during that time certainly can add their comments also. So first, we're going to start with introductions, and we're going to go from the 50s on up. We almost have the seating order right, so we'll just give this a shot. So, name and roughly when you were director of tripping.
Hi, I'm Pat Hodgson, and I was a director of tripping about 1960, 61. It came as a total shock to me. I was relatively young at the time. I suspect some of your directors have. Prior to that, the directors of tripping at Pathfinder had generally been senior educators, and I had no idea how much responsibility I was assuming, and I thank God that all went well and everybody came back alive, and we only lost a couple of canoes during the whole time.
Hi, I'm Bob Coakley. I think I was director of tripping from about 64 to 71 or 2. So sort of the late 60s.
My name is Jim Coakley, and I think I go by Gyro, and I was director of tripping in 67 and also again in the late 70s.
I'm Mark Smith, Smitty. I was director of canoe tripping in the late 70s through 1983. And Gyro and I were actually co-directors of canoe tripping, I believe, somewhere in the late 70s. Yes, I do have a paddle room named after me, but that was...
I'm Jeff Thrall. I was co-director of tripping with Bob Rogo in 1974.
I'm Mac Rand. I owned the place for a while, and I was also DOT in 84, 85, and part of 86.
Alex Thompson, I was DOT 87, I guess, or 88-ish, and up for about 5 years after that.
Dan Fabrizio, I was DOT in, 99 through 2001.
Zach Aram, I was DOT 2006 to 2008. My name is Kyle Warren. I was DOT last year, 2012.
And we're missing a few. I'm Bob Rogo. I was director of tripping in the, 73, somewhere in that area, 72 to about 70, off and on through the 70s. So.
And I'm Steve Zimkoyak. I've been DOT for the past couple years. Okay, so we're going to hear era by era. And some of the topics that we'd like to hear about is how you went about packing food, what the challenges were that you faced, what equipment was like, how you prepared for your big trips, and we'd just like to see how those topics have changed over the years.
Okay, so we're going to start with Pat, who's going to give us tripping as he remembers it from basically the 50s, and he probably has some historical background. He may even go back farther than that. And we'll cover that era first, then move on to Bob Coakley, for the 60s.
Back in my era, it was pretty much a personal thing. And, of course, most of the is that better? Okay, you got to talk at the top of this one. Most of the kids were here for a full season, so you really got to know the kids quite a lot better, which was both a plus and a minus depending on whether the kids were liking tripping. And it was pretty much a required activity. Everybody had to do at least one trip, and most volunteered to go on more to get out of camp. Generally speaking, the trip staff had a hell of a lot of independence in terms of what they did, how they cooked, what food they took, within the limits of what was available in the trading post. And sometimes we would go out and buy things on our own and contribute them to add a little zest to the trip. I can remember bacon not being available, and I would go and buy bacon, or you'd go and buy some steaks, and out of your $250 that you were paid by Chief Norton for the summer, you'd go out and spend $10 on steaks. But I think also, aside from having a great deal of independence, we were much less trained than the staff is today. I've been amazed to hear about all the safety training. We got half an hour from the Red Cross life-saving people, and that was about it. And a med kit that weighed probably 10 pounds, and it always opened up, and water in your, whether it was the med kit or water in your food, was the number one problem. This is the era before plastic bags came into vogue, and we thought that waterproof was a cotton bag, and that was as close as we came. And generally speaking, you're on longer trips, your food got wet, it got moldy, and you tried to use it anyway without making everybody sick. So things have improved a great deal. The most interesting trip I went on was with Tom Dodd, and he had an experimental trip to try out new food. I guess I would describe it best that everybody starved. This was the first experiment with we went with basically flour, sugar, canned dehydrated vegetables, and bacon, which was rotten in about 3 days, and that had to last us into Brent, and it didn't. But I thank Tom tremendously for teaching me his on-trip baking skills, which I used throughout my years, and I thought that added a nice touch on trips. A voice of the 60s. Or
Can we ask a question as you go along?
Yeah, sure.
When you transferred from the wooden Wanigans over to packs?
I had packs the whole time I was here, but the packs were at the beginning. The packs were only for food, and the bedrolls were carried with tump lines, and we didn't have sleeping bags. We had blanket rolls. So you'd put that in your duffel bag, and a good camper could carry 2 of those. And the packs were for pots, pans, tents, and food, and our tents were heavy. The weight of the tents has come down tremendously, and I think they keep water out now.
I don't know, Mac, do you, in terms of the book, paddles, as far as Wanigans, I can't recall necessarily if you were able to address that at all.
No, the pictures that I saw of Wanigans really seem to be from Al Chestnut's era. I think a bit farther back.
So probably back in the late the 30s.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I can remember Wanigans being shipped to Cedar Lake on the train. That's what they were using them for in my era. So you'd leave with 6 or 7 days food, and you'd get these wonderful wooden boxes with your next 6 or 7 days in.
I would be curious, Pat, in terms of routes that you would take in that. I mean, were you exclusively tripping within Algonquin Park? You went out.
Yes, certainly in the up. I mean, I think I was probably a pioneer in trying to get outside the park, but I didn't go very far. I had a trip down the Oxtongue River. But no, we were basically in the park. That was in the 60s.
That was the 60s.
I was trying to in the 50s. The trips were in the park, and we didn't have to reserve. We didn't have to reserve campsites either.
I think 1943 probably the last of the Wanagans.
Okay.
I was just guessing because my first year was 44.
All right. If you couldn't hear that,
Still were there were a few kicking around.
all right. Jeff Miller felt that maybe the last Wanagans were in the early 40s.
Yes.
So, okay, thanks. All right.
I guess carrying on from what Pat said, it's pretty similar through a lot of the 60s, although the program was evolving then as it still is now. We still carried canned food. When you're outfitting for a trip, a 9-man trip, you took 3 cans, so each person got a third of a can of whatever it was. 3 cans of vegetables and 3 cans of some sort of meat type of thing for supper. Add that up for 6 or 7 days and multiply it by a pound per can. Cans used to be 16 ounces at that time. So multiply that by a pound per can. And we were going out there with these heavy canvas tents that I agree with Pat. They did a wonderful job in the rain. And all these canned foods, 75-pound food packs were not unusual for the older kids. And as time went on, we got into more lighter weight foods. More freeze-dried stuff was starting to become available toward the end of the 60s and on into the early 70s. And we phased the weight of the packs down. We got tents that were no lighter but waterproof. The Green Woods tents. Anybody here remember those? Those kept the rain out, but they were pretty heavy. Garbage bags had been invented by then, and sleeping bags were dry. That was a huge change. The number one thing in the early trips that I remember was you were always wet if it rained for the rest of the trip. Sleeping bags never dried all the way out. Sleeping bags were when you rolled them up with a bedroll, they were a diameter of about a foot. And everything in them was wet. That's why we came back year after year. There's no way you can duplicate that. But I think the routes were mostly in the park. The kind of the challenging routes were in the western part of the park where they hadn't cut things out. You know, the park changed a lot between 1960 and 1970, I think, too. They started putting up portage signs. They bushed back the portages, cleared them so that you could follow them more easily. A lot of bridging went in. We did some of it. We did Iris Alder. I think Pat was responsible for that. And it became easier to get to the same places than it had before, so we kept looking for places that it was harder to get to for our more challenging trips. But those were always in the park. And then toward the end, we started a couple Temagami trips. Dave Bonner took one up to Temagami in 63, 2. And then we took some more years after that and branched out. And I think that lit the fire on going farther north and farther away. And people are still doing it, although I think they've run into a dead end. You can't go farther north. They did it this year without ice skates. So I think that covers the rest of the 60s that I can think of. Questions?
Yeah, Eric Peterson. I was wondering if you had trouble with bears in the 60s.
Yes.
No. We never had any trouble with bears. They had some trouble with us, but yeah.
I had Jim Coakley as the second man on a trip, and I think we heard a bear, and I asked him to go out and check and see what. You all know what the response was, so I won't go any further.
We did Pat was a head man, I was a third man on a trip. We got run off Camp Minising by a bear at about midnight. Not only was he a camper, Pat and the second man whose name I don't remember and I were in the staff tent in the rain. And Jeff Thrall, as a 10-year-old, came to the tent and said, "You want to see a bear?" I've never been out on a trip with Jeff since then. Yeah, we had bear trouble, and that was before we did bear ropes. We didn't think I think bear ropes were in the 70s or 80s. Anything else?
Yeah, there weren't marked campsites. Were there places where people camped, and did you have a park map in the 50s?
The park map. Yeah, the park map was. Well, is it still down there in the trading post? The old white one? No, it was about the same as this, but with no contour lines, and with some of the lakes not actually in the right place. But
Actually, yeah. So
yeah, that's the one. That persevered for a long time. It's a good map. Campsites weren't marked, but there was no rule that you had to camp on a campsite. You camped where you camped, but there were places on lakes where people camped. You left stringers because the tents, all stringers are poles to put the tents on, because everybody carried tents that you had to tie up to poles. You didn't have these springy, framey things. And you always left firewood, and that worked pretty well. Toward the end of the 60s, it worked terribly. But at the beginning, that worked pretty well. They were almost always there. So camping was where you wanted to. A lot of the campsites you use today were ones that we were using then. It's funny how your memory goes away when you're old like I am. I've repressed that. They were white canvas tents, A-shaped tents, no pullouts on the side, a floor, cheesecloth. Miles of cheesecloth was the way I would describe the bug netting. It worked, but it wasn't a zipper closed thing. You spent all your time putting your boots along the bug netting at the bottom to keep the bugs out. I'm seeing some shaking heads there. A lot of people remember that. And as long as you didn't touch the inside of the tent during the rain, it would shed water reasonably well. But there was no way to avoid that, and it depended on your age. The staff tent was usually a lot drier than the camper tents.
The park actually not only didn't have campsites, there were no toilet facilities, as it were, on very many campsites. There were about 24 forts on campsites in the park. Every campsite had a can pit at it. After you opened your 3 cans and heated up the product and passed it out to the campers and staff for supper, you'd wash out the cans and throw them in the can pit.
maybe you could expand a little, Gyro, on the toilet facilities and what was the favorite type of toilet facility.
Bob Rogo has been obsessed about toilet facilities in forts for almost 70 years.
They're extremely important. I thought you might talk about birches.
Well, I think that Bob Ludwig would be the expert on creating bouncing birches on the campsite that would be useful for.
Stand up, Bob, and just quickly describe what a bouncing birch is. No. All right, I think most of you can imagine what that's all about. So, actually, I became director of canoe tripping in the early 70s. I'm just going to jump in. And John Laybuddy and I co-directed the first year, and that would have been, I believe, 72. So the one thing I want to point out, and I can let Mac maybe expand on it because he was the head man. Bob mentioned expanding trips outside of the park, like into Temagami and that. Well, in the early 70s, Mac led the first, I believe it was the very first expedition into Kippawa area in the Des Moines River. And so that was certainly a more ambitious outing. And then I think it was actually the year after, maybe 2 years after that. That's the Wanapatai trip. Okay, so he might talk about that a little bit when we get down to his turn there. So Gyro, do you want to wait a second? Jeff, did you have anything? We're moving into the early 70s. You were 74. Anything you want to say? No. Yes, Jeff. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, there's actually a stove somewhere in Source Lake that,
A stove?
I'm pretty sure that's not true. It went all the way to the dump. I'm quite sure.
For those of you who didn't hear that in the back, Jeff Miller just mentioned not only were there can pits formed on campsites, but one of the other options was to paddle the empty cans out to the middle of the lake on a trip and sink them to the bottom. So that was our level of sensitivity at that point in time. Okay. Yes. You know, as I think about it, speaking of cans, that makes me think about bottles. And I think there is back in the old days, sad to say now, I think there may be from over in the mainland at a former cabin over there, all the way to Source, and there's probably a trench of empty beer bottles.
I think you can see it from space.
Okay, we're not very proud of that at this point in time. Okay. Why don't we just move on into the 70s a little bit? Gyro and Smitty, why don't you just pick up some of the 70s from your perspectives?
Well, this was sort of the late 70s and into the 80s. And at that time, I would say we were transitioning from canvas tents to nylon tents. Cost was a big factor back in those days, and freeze-dried foods started to become available, if I recall this correctly. And we had an outfit by the name of George Barbeau. And the owner at the time thought that it would be most efficient if we had George Barbeau make up our trip meals instead of having all just freeze-dried foods. So we did that for a while, and this would be, in the trading post there would be big bulk trash cans full of flour and sugar and all those types of things, and we would make up the meals ahead of time. So unlike where maybe in your day you made them out on the trip, they were made up ahead of time in various bags. So you had lunch, dinner marked on all these things, then you would make them up. And we still typed our trips on that wonderful little black typewriter that was up in the trading post. We didn't have computers yet, so that's how Gyro and I typed our trips. We had to, this was now an era where we had to go over to the Nature Museum or somewhere to get permits to go on the trip, so we actually had to plan ahead of time. And we were given priority, but you had to know where the trips were going, and you had to give it a lot of advanced planning. So those are some of the things. We started transitioning to nicer packs. We started, the canoes were starting to get a little bit lighter. Our trips started, they started under Mac's, I think, era, going to Temagami and Kippawa. We continued that. A long trip was 18 or 19 days. We didn't have such things as what I just heard about, a 32-day trip with polar bears and things like that. That was not even on the radar screen, I think, at that point in time. So I would call it sort of a transitioning era.
Gyro, did you want to add anything to the 70s? Okay. All right. Why don't we move into the sort of the 80s, Mac? You started off.
Actually, just to back up a little bit, just talking about the change in routes, as a camper in the late 60s, for all of us who were here at that point, the western boundary was your goal in life, right? If you did the boundary, you had reached the pinnacle of Pathfinder tripping. And I did it in 67. Well, Bob and I tried it in 67. Did it in 68 with Gyro, 69 with Bob. But by the time I was a headman a few years later, suddenly we're going to Quebec and we're going to Temagami. So that whole change in routes really kind of took place, or made a dramatic leap during the decade of the 70s. I was DOT for a couple of years. Smitty was kind enough to return for my first year as owner. I like to think it was out of loyalty, but he just wanted to be here, just like everybody else. So I had this amazing crew of staff to help me through that first year. In 1984, a certain Mitchell Ogden Anderson, who will remain nameless, was supposed to be DOT. We have the proof of it. I believe it's still hanging in the command center, in the trading post. Something happened. Mitchell couldn't make it, and so I stepped into the breach and did it for a couple of years. You know, it's hard being DOT because you want to be creative. You want to come up with trips. You know, it's easy to say, yeah, they'll go to Lindaburn Island. Yeah, they'll go to Welcome. But when you try and make things a little less cookie cutter and try and add something kind of different, go a different route, go someplace that we don't normally go, and be creative. I mean, clearly, the best thing that we were able to do during my 2.5 years was going to another place that ended in Bay, not quite as far as this year's, but that was our biggest accomplishment. But you know, the changes in style, the changes in equipment. We haven't really talked about the changes in canoes because for, of course, most of our collective experience, we were using wood canvas canoes. One year in 1974, Smitty was my bowman. He did a horrible job as a bowman. Broke a canoe in half. I got the canvas. Swifty and Roy got my paycheck. That's what happens when you have a wood canvas canoe on the Des Moines, a million miles from anywhere.
Yeah, but you got the canvas.
I did get the canvas, and I had it for a long time. And I probably got more pleasure out of the canvas than I would have out of my measly paycheck. But we started under... somebody up here will know when we got the first Royal X boats. I'm not sure I do.
78.
78. So right after... Could have been a year before, maybe 2 years before would have been helpful. But when we started doing these trips of going way out there, when you weren't close to an access point, and when you're doing these amazing whitewater trips, we needed to get away just a little bit from that wood canvas tradition, and it just made sense to have Royal X boats. And if you've ever seen, you can go on YouTube and see pictures of Royal X boats being dropped off buildings and bouncing up and being just fine. Clearly, we still have a huge wood canvas tradition, but that was a big change that occurred late 70s, 80s, and continues today. Simon? No. There was a classic trip, but I won't go into it, just that we used once on a mid-season trip. But I did it for a couple of years, and I got to the point about halfway through 86 that I just wanted to focus on the Bay trip because I couldn't be creative anymore. And I said, oh, Simon Mortimer, you are going to be the DOT now. And he ran the show for, how long, Simon? Come on up. For a couple of years, and then handed over to Alex. So here's Alex.
Hey. I was, I mean, I think at the time when I was DOT, we were, things had, you know, the equipment had gotten to where, you know, the nylon tents and all that stuff. We were still using those woods packs, and we tried to hold on to those for tradition for a long time, but, you know, the strap would break, or, you know, it'd get all, the leather was no good, so it was all like, almost like a wire cutter on your shoulders. And but I remember every beginning of every year, we'd take like, we have to take 20 packs in and get them sewed up or get the leather fixed, and that went on for a while. But then, you know, Max started really, I think a lot of the equipment was getting pretty worn out, and Max started, when he took over, improving, got better tents. The Eurekas were the best find ever. Those are great tents. And the new tripping packs we use now. But we still did everything. We had Bourbeau there. You had your 9,000 calorie bags and your 11,000 calorie bags, and you were supposed to calculate the height and weight of the child and how many calories they would eat a day, and you had to do all this stuff. But you know, people just would take, like, I'll just take 4 mac and cheeses, and that's my dinner. So, but we did that for a while, and then we tried to be creative at those times too. A dear friend of mine who came up here to camp, Dave Bannigan, and after seeing the first Voyageur movie, said to me, "Why don't we do that? Why don't you do that?" And I'm like, "Okay, well, all right, we'll get some kids together and we'll do that." And they got the old canvas cedar strip war canoe, and we trucked them to Opeongo, and that was quite a sight. Like, we weren't even sure we could get the van, like get the boat on the van, and So there's like 8 people putting this huge waterlogged war canoe, and they went up Opeongo, and people were talking about it last night, but they said the looks from the tourists was priceless, you know. And they all had berets, and the staff had corncob pipes, you know, and then they portaged it. They made it to Burn Island, and they brought canvas, and they slept under the canoe like that, and there was a tree that got blown down in a windstorm and fell on the canoe. They're on Happy Isle. And punctured a huge hole and in the side of it. So they had to go back. They're going to try to trip all the way down to Joe Lake where we're going to pick them up. Joe Lake, we're going to pick them up. But they had to repair it, and there wasn't a lot of ambroid at that time. Ambroid had kind of fallen away. So there was duct tape and this wonderful bread we used to get for quite a while called Schleiserbrot. It was this dark brown German rye. So they took the heel of the Schleiserbrot and shoved it into the hole, fit perfectly, duct taped it in there, and it was watertight. And I don't know who was telling me. Somebody was telling Quentin Mason, is he here? Quentin was saying, I came back to the island like 5 years, and you could still see the lump in the side of the bread was still in there. The stuff never rotted. And then we went down to, we sent some trips down the York River, down to Bancroft. I mean, really going south and trying to get some of the Opeongo River, stuff like that people just didn't go to anymore, try to go to places. And Derek Irwin took a trip, and he decided to make his own portages. So he was bushing between lakes just to try to mix it up. But he said that didn't go so well because there's a lot of logging going in the park that you don't know about, and there's all these like vast expanses of where they would just cut all the branches and leave them behind, and so here they are with their topographic maps and compasses and come across this brush field, and so that was the only time we did that. But I think back then the other transition was, I think, from Mac from the previous time. There was a big in-camp program, and kids would go on 1, maybe 2 trips, but there was always a lot to do in here, and Mac started to push us more to like where they are today, where the kids don't even want to be in camp. Like, I'm amazed how much these kids just like want to go out. They don't, you know, and I think that was a shift that Mac started doing when I was DOT, and we did more mountain biking you got going, and we did some rock climbing and sailing, stuff like that.
All right, thanks. Dan, I think we're moving sort of into the 90s, isn't that? Yeah. So why don't you stand up here? You can sit over here.
Well, late 90s, early 2000, 2001, at least we saw a change in ownership from Mac to Glenn and Slads, and we had gotten pretty good at tripping in Quebec and the park in Temagami, and we were getting pretty good at tripping in James Bay, Matagami River, Missinaba, and I started to think about Lake Superior, North Shore Lake Superior, and scouted the White River with Eric Willers, who was DOT between Alex and myself, and we started to do the research on that, as well as the Herkenau rivers. I never ended up putting the trips together, but Zach, right behind me, he was able to pull it off, and sky's the limit. Since then, we've been doing some pretty big trips, and I'm going to hand it over to Zach and let him take it.
Well, again, I was DOT 2006 to 2008. Before me, Adam Mullenberg and Brent were in command. Just thinking, as everyone has been talking up here, just about some of the different things. Obviously, I'll hit on some of the, kind of pushing the boundaries as to some of the bigger trips that we've been doing as of the past 10 years. But one thing I was thinking, Mac was talking about getting creative, and it can be really challenging to be creative, when you're talking in the park and just the same routes. And I think one thing that we don't really think about is, Steve and I and Kyle more recently as DOTs is just having the ability to transport to wherever we want to go, basically. I don't know when, Gyro, maybe you know, when that first started, like being able to take a trip to Kiosk. Yeah, truck.
But Mac was the one that started with. We had 2 vans when you owned the camp. One of them was the Blue Dog. We had 2 vans, starting with Mac.
Well, one of the great romantic ways to travel around this park, of course, was by train. And some of us were fortunate enough to have train trips as part of our trip. Sometimes it was because, there's a terrible headwind, right, JLA? But other times it was actually windy and wavy. But other times, and you know what? I looked at trips from the 1920s and 30s when my dad was here, and taking the train often was part of those trips. And canoes would be left over at the Bruley station so that you could hop on the train here, go to Bruley, pick up your boats, and go off someplace. So the idea of trucking a trip, whether it's by train or by truck, certainly was not new. It went back to some of our earliest days. But I remember going out in '69 with Bob. It was a big deal to start and finish at camp. I mean, I felt like going to different access points really had begun by then, but we really wanted to pull into the... I tell you, one of the cool things at the end of a long trip was to spend the night at the lumber camp or at Glen Donald. Even though you could see the island, you didn't want to come back here. You wanted to stay out in that trip. The headman would come in and get your mail, get bread, butter, bacon, all that good stuff. They would maybe see their friends at night. I don't know. That's what I've heard. Never. And, but it became more and more rare that we would start and finish a trip here because you've got 20 access points around the park, and you can cover so much more territory and see so many more cool places by starting on what would have been day 5 or day 6 of the trip rather than starting here and having to get up to that point. So that's been going on for quite a while.
Yeah, I think that with 2 vans that in good repair and 2 trailers in good repair and going every day with a dedicated staff of drivers is relatively newer. I mean, but it's an expansion of what you were doing. But in the days that most of us were directors tripping, we'd send 50 or so trips a year, and now we're in the 80s, a number of trips being sent. So naturally, the trucking increases.
Another thing, equipment, which has been talked about a lot. Obviously, huge change in equipment. We're fortunate enough to be able to get the best gear. Something breaks, it's simple just to go down to AO and grab something either on the way, on the truck trip, or right before a trip. So equipment certainly has changed. One thing that I really tried to do in the teepee was to try and make it more efficient, and I'm sure it's evolved, every single year and decade. But it used to be every headman would have their own locker with their own gear for the entire summer, and inevitably things would break, so people would just end up going into someone else's locker and stealing it, and Never.
Not by anybody here.
No, not anyone here for sure. But so one thing I tried to do is I took the locker system and changed it to locker 1 is for tents, locker 2 is for packs, locker 3. So you'd have your trip and you'd come in and you'd just take what was there. So it was everyone's. So everyone's taking care of it. And to see it now, I haven't been back in a couple of years, but to see how it's just evolved from that, and it seems to be working very well, which is great. They got the packs all hanging up individually. Things aren't, getting moldy and being put in wet. So the equipment has certainly been a big change and allowed us to, kind of push the limits a little bit. Food, certainly. Is there Harvest Food Works anymore at all?
No, we don't do.
Yeah. So that was, same when I was DOT, I started to realize we would get this Harvest Food Work dry food These packages would cost a lot of money, and they didn't taste good at all. They'd fill you up, but no one really enjoyed them that much. So we just stopped doing it. I mean, it was just pasta and rice anyway, so, getting creative with different ideas, being able to look, in the Cisco, inventory of food and just come up with new ideas. And again, I mean, what's going on nowadays on canoe trips with what people are cooking and coming up with is pretty incredible. And then, again, wanted to talk about just kind of the progression of, or the evolution of these long trips that we've been going on. It really started in '86 with the Missinaba. But I was fortunate enough where I was in, my last year as a camper was Mac's last year as owner. So I was able to do kind of like the biggest trip at that time, which was Lake Superior to James Bay, down the Missinaba. And from what I remembered, it was every 3 years or so there'd be a bay trip. And then as the CIT, it was my first year, and that was Glenn and Mac, Glenn and Slads' first year. So I was able to do, the White River. So I was able to kind of go on these, pushing the boundaries firsthand. So that gave me the mindset of, this is what I love doing. And you can't beat the park, obviously. That's the heart and soul of camp. But seeing what was out there firsthand, getting to do the Harkinon in 2002 as a second man with Alex, Hurley, and Tim, Lamont, and Barrett, I think it really just kind of opened my eyes to what was out there that we could do. Obviously the biggest thing is safety, having the training, being able to do these big expeditions. You have to know your limits and what you can handle. But I just always saw it as, I think if you're sending the right people and we have the right gear now, that we can really do anything as long as we can get to it. And as long as people, obviously when we're doing these big trips, I mean, someone's paying for it. So, campers, parents are having, they're being involved in the process. Are you willing to, pay for your child to go this far to be able to take a flight out or train ride or whatever it is? So, but there's just so much out there. I think there certainly is a limit for camp. There's, the Northwest Territories and, way up there, I think is just completely out of the picture. But I was talking to Steve about this last night. I personally feel that anywhere in Ontario and Quebec is well within the limits of what camp can do. And obviously that was proven this year with doing the Winnisk. I mean, that's as big, as remote as it gets. So, I think that at the same time, some people have also looked at it like, this is a bad thing for camp. We're going all these places. Well, what about the park? And like I said, I think that the park is the heart and soul, and that'll never change. And one of my goals is DOT, and I'm sure Steve was, we try to hit every area of the park every single year, both halves. And that's,
just to jump in there too, with the campers, one of our goals is to really build the camper's tripping resume. So if we have a knot that comes and it's his second year at camp and he hasn't been down the Pet, or he hasn't done the Barren, or he hasn't been up South River, I'm not going to send that kid to Temagami or down the Des Moines. He has to have a strong knowledge of this place. That's our backyard. Because this is, as Zach was saying, it's the heart of this camp. Algonquin Park is where it's at.
Steve, out of 78 trips this year, 78, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many went out of the park? Do you know off the top of your head? About?
I think about 7 or 8.
So 90% of our tripping
Right.
is still here.
Right.
Good. Next.
Go ahead. Yes. Yeah, well, I think one big thing that we really haven't touched on at all is, obviously there's Tamagami and La Verandra, which are similar, in lakes and rivers to Algonquin, but these big trips that we're going on, it's whitewater, so that's a huge thing. So I think a big part of wanting to go out of the park is that whitewater experience. The thrill of shooting whitewater is pretty incredible. And again, that goes to Steve was talking about the resume of the campers. They're going to Palmer Rapids on the Madawaska to train for that, and the resume of the staff too. I mean, their hard skills and the soft skills, like Slads is talking about throughout last night. But yeah, going back to just being on these trips, I think whitewater is a big thing. I think when you get out there, I had a chance to do the Attawapiskat River for the first time in 2007, and we didn't see anyone besides the 12 of us for over 2 weeks. So whereas in the park, every day you're going to be seeing people. So yeah, go ahead.
In terms of landscape, though, I would say the lakes are definitely much bigger. Portaging, Kyle can speak to this. Kyle was a headman on the Winnisk this summer, so I don't think you portage that much.
We probably. Yeah, I am good with the microphone. We probably had about, I would say, a total of 20 portages on the whole trip out of the 32 days. And some of those were just liftovers, just over rock ledges in the river. To me, I think the biggest landscape difference to here is the vegetation. The only kind of trees that you really see are spruce trees, and then the topography. It's just completely flat up there. You think of Algonquin Park as not being a mountainous area, but you come back here and look over at Bear Mountain, and it looks like Everest.
So my question's for Kyle or any of the headmen who came off of the trip this summer. Traditionally, we always paddle 3 people per boat. Bigger volume rivers, was there any time that you felt overexposed, 3 per boat, or was there a desire to ever run step 2 per boat and make a transition to that in the future?
Repeat his question.
So Brian was asking if it would be easier on some of these trips to be in a tandem boat as opposed to 3 people in a boat. And I think there's a lot of different opinions about that at camp, and it would make it much easier in moving water situations, but I think as far as Pathfinder tripping and our style of tripping, sticking 3 to a boat definitely didn't make it more difficult or unsafe at any times. It was just new risks to manage throughout the trip.
Al.
Hi, Alex Hurley. I'd just like to change the tune a bit. My family has been sent out on trips by all of you for over 53 years. You have rewarded us with incredible adventures, but at the same time, you've royally screwed us. Your job is about creating movies that are creative, and you've done such a great job, but also it's a big part of it is managing all of these personalities. How hard is it to decide who you screw? Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's easy.
Pretty easy, Alex.
Yeah, it's pretty easy. Well, you know,
there was a. I mean, we used to have just 10 headmen, and that was it. And then I think there was years we had 8 headmen. You know, that was an issue for a little while there, and so we started combing the ranks to find more people to go on trips. Enrollment was down for a while there with Mac, and then he got it back up again, and so we didn't have enough trip lockers, like we didn't have enough stuff, and we were short on people, so we started, recruiting we'd recruit from the kitchen, and we started recruiting from the swim dock, and Brooks Anderson had told us for years that a woman's ovaries would pop if she carried a canoe, which we proved not to be true. And my wife proudly carried Iris Elder. But so we started putting women out on canoe trips and stuff. But when it came to a Hurley, we pretty much just made sure your life was miserable.
And the other problem that we had was when there weren't enough campers. There wasn't always that we had 100 and some odd campers. Many times we had 50 or less. And we had a lot of headmen and a lot of staff. And sometimes it was a matter of making sure that every staff man went out on at least one trip. It wasn't even a question of, how many trips they were going to go out on. I do recall an incident where one staff man came up to me during one of those periods when all the other staff were in like lapdogs just wanting to go somewhere. And I put him on the Bonashears trip. And he came in to complain that he was on the Bonashears trip. And unfortunately, he didn't go on another trip for the rest of the year. He didn't go on the Bonashears trip, and he was in camp staff for the rest of the year. So that was also a problem.
Another thing, too, with I was talking about the transition with Mac, when we had the big in-camp program, kids would go on one trip and they want to hang out in camp the whole time. So there was a problem also recruiting kids to go on the trips. I mean, I remember times when there was 30 kids in camp and none of them want to go on trips. So I think that's a big shift that I was saying before. You guys have these kids they're just like, when am I going out? Let's go, let's go. So I think that was a change in mentality at camp too. And I think that also changing that mentality allowed kids to get, better resumes and then be able to do these bigger trips. Because, you'd have kids that are AAs that maybe went on one trip every year, and the biggest trip they ever went on was a 7-day trip. So
we had that in the 60s and 70s, too, though. I mean, we had kids that wanted to go out on trips. When we got the generator and then we published what movies were coming, we'd have, I don't want to go on a trip next week, so I'd miss movie night and all that. So, I mean, it got to be a little ridiculous. But we had to recruit campers to go on trips sometimes. Most of them were here for a 7-week experience, and they wanted to go on in the whole 7 weeks, about 3 trips maximum. Now they're here for a 3.5-week experience, and they want to go on 2 or more trips during the half.
Yeah, and if I can speak to that also, Alex actually triggered something for me, and that I always felt that some of my best trips were a result of the personality mixture of the campers and staff. And so I know when I was directing the canoe tripping program, I really tried to make an effort to ask the kids who they would like to go out with. Now, there's a plus and a minus to that, because sometimes they would always pick the same friends and that. So within that context, you also try to occasionally throw in someone who maybe they didn't know as well, or they didn't consider a personal friend or whatever. But I really believe that, if you could put campers together who were looking forward to being with the other campers on the trip, and actually that applied to staff too, that was a real plus. But sometimes the puzzle didn't always work, so we wrestled with that. And as far as the staff, there was always, I remember from some individuals, lobbying from headmen for certain other staff on their trip. And that sometimes became a little bit dicey, if I remember.
I don't have any recollection of that.
Okay. Yeah, Jay.
The one thing we tried was, I remember interviewing headmen and asking them, what would you like to do? Not where to necessarily, I want the boundary.
Just stand up and maybe so everyone
Not
can.
necessarily that I want the boundary, but what are you interested in? Is it whitewater? Is it this? Take a look at the history of where they had been already, how many years they'd been there, and try to accommodate those needs. I can honestly say, and I bleed for you, because I don't know how many times I got screwed myself. I mean, I was forced to go out with your dad and Bob Rogo. I mean, it was awful. And GT and me.
I was forced into trips with GT and Mitchell Anderson also.
Okay, so we'll cut questions off for a second. We'll get to you. I just want to talk about my few years as DOT sending these big trips. Like I said, the park is the place to be for me. The big trips are great, and it is an experience of a lifetime, but Algonquin Park is where it's at. 5 years from now, I would like to see more of the same of what's going on. I would love for us to continue to do these new rivers. I think at the 95th, since then, we've done 4 new rivers. So, I mean, if we can continue on that pace, it'd be a pretty cool thing. So I think the tripping program now is in a great spot, and I think the staff are trained and some of the best staff that we've ever had. So I think the sky's the limit for us.
Mitchell Anderson.
How do you guys research the new rivers, and how do you approach the parents saying, we're going to send your kid to polar bear country?
I don't know if we told them that we were sending them to polar bear country. So Mitch asked, how do we research the trips and how do we approach the parents? Research, we have a ton of literature in the teepee that we look at. We go online. There's a great website, My Canadian Canoe Routes, and we get a ton of intel from that. We have contacts in the communities up there that we talk to, so outfitters, people at the First Nations, and SLADS usually deals with talking to the parents. So
the trips are planned before July 1st, right?
So this one we started planning in January. So we had the staff down probably in March, and route was determined in March. So a ton of planning.
Back to kids not wanting to go at all. You gave an example, I think, of 30 or 40 kids that were in the pool that could have gone on a trip, and none of them wanted to go. I remember, I don't know how long ago it was well after I was active here, that some parents that I knew had kids that didn't want to come back here because the trip was too tough. Is that not a common situation?
Okay, so what Jeff was asking about campers who didn't want to go on trips, were reluctant, also those that maybe came back from trips and didn't have an enjoyable experience or whatever, and just too tough for them. And
Difference in kids these days, or
so basically, are there a difference in sort of personality profiles or whatever regarding kids these days? And
I think for an awful lot of us, our first trip sucked. I know mine did. No offense to Arrow. But the second one was better. And I went bushing, and I thought, wow, it sucked less. Yeah. Canoe tripping is not something that most of us are used to doing. And if you only send a kid out that one time, there's a good chance that what you're just talking about is going to happen. We'd like to give the kids flexibility to say, to have them sign up again. But sometimes, in spite of what the movie schedule is, you have to say, okay, you are going to go out again because you need to have that second and third experience. And sometimes it's a whole summer before you even begin to understand what you're doing out there. So I think sometimes we just have to play the mean guy and say, you're going to go on the trip. You can't leave it up to an 11-year-old who's never done anything physical in his life, because otherwise they'll continue in that mode. I don't know if you guys are still doing that, but to say you know, the kids have some say in it, but you're going to go on a trip.
We also recently have started kind of giving more of an easier trip for some first guys. That's why we started our fishing trips and the outpost trips, along with that in-camp program stuff, is because it gets them hooked on camp, and then, maybe that next trip won't suck so much, and the next trip won't suck so much, and then they're hooked on canoe tripping just like everybody else got.
Yeah, I think it varies. How hard a trip is varies somewhat with the commitment of Algonquin Park to interior maintenance. There are periods since the war where they've done very little maintenance in the park, and then there are periods where they've done a lot more. So a trip that you and I may have taken in the 50s or 60s or sometime like that, and it was pretty easy, and we had good days, and we were in the campsites at between 2 and 3 in the afternoon. When you get into these low maintenance periods or you have these blowdowns, then they do get to be hard trips. So I'm not sure. I don't think that there's any difference in kids at all from my observation from watching kids here since the last 50 years. They mature physically slightly earlier.
This is a Cedar Strip question. In the mid-'60s when I was here, there was a pecking order. We would have 1 or 2 new canoes a year, and that would go to the director of tripping, and then it would pass down. The pecking order was a huge thing. I mean, this is when lockers and equipment were picked in the same way. This was before Jack started making canoes and before the canoe shop and Warren started doing. What's happening with the canoe program, the equipment itself?
It seems like now with Warren fixing up the boats during the spring and fall and having guys in there helping him out, the whole fleet is looking pretty beautiful, as you guys can see just from walking around the dock. So, it used to be that the CITs and the second men had these waterlogged heavy boats that might have floated, might not. And now second men, we do a lottery at the beginning of the summer, and all the trip staff in that same pecking order of kind of rank will roll a big dice, and everybody gets to pick a boat in that order. And the second men and CITs are pulling out boats that are 5 years old or were just refinished last year. Yep, and if a boat gets broken, if they have a couple days in camp, then they head up to the shop and work with Warren to get it patched up. Sometimes it doesn't work out that well because we have enough campers to keep the staff out of camp for the entire summer, and so they go right back out.
I watched the lottery and watched number 18 pick 2 years ago, who had a better canoe, number 18 pick, than I had when I was director of tripping. And I've been bitter about it ever since.
How do, I guess this is for the newer DOTs, or maybe any DOT, but how do you choose routes, given that a lot of rivers are being dammed, and with that environmental aspect, does that factor into your choices? Do you work with governments? How does that work?
We haven't worked with governments at all, but we did the Rupert in 2008. Kyle and I did the trip, and there was a dam halfway through, but we just had to go around it. With these rivers up in Ontario, I know there's big diamond mining up there right now. So at this point, I think we're trying to get to and do as many as we can before it becomes an issue.
And no matter what area it is, there's always, any wilderness area has natural resources that, somebody wants to mine or dam or something. So in a way, all these rivers and all these wilderness areas are pretty much, they're on our list because you never know how long they're going to be around.
With the big trips and with Temagami trips and Des Moines trips, we don't get permits for those. So, we're not making reservations. We're just sending the trips out there.
Okay, I think unless someone from the DOT group has...
Brian, do you have a question?
Oh, I missed it.
So now it's standard for AA trips to take spot
when did technology start to come into trips for safety and communication? Like, when was the sat phone on a trip for the first time?
Yeah, I remember on the Harkanaw, we had a sat phone, which was 2002. But really spotty. Like when we did the Attawapiskat in 2007, I mean, we couldn't even. We're making calls, and it was maybe you'd get 20 seconds in, and then you'd have to call back, or just nothing at all. But yeah, probably early 2000s. Yeah. Spot pagers more recently.
Was there anything used before a sat phone on a trip, or was it just access point, trip out, find a phone?
Well, and now in the park, I don't know how far it goes, but when I was here in last year, 2008, I mean, you could use your cell phone on Burn Island. So I don't know if that's expanded, but I remember there was a situation. I think it was actually Dan Davis was on the trip, and there was a Northway trip, and they were trying to call, and so yeah.
How about bear bangers?
This was the first year for bear bangers. Before all of these big trips go out, though, we do a pretty detailed evac plan. So, it's a list of all the access points that are on the river, and what you would do location-wise. So say you're at, 320 kilometers from the end of the river. Where are you going to go? Who are you going to call? And then when we do the sat phones, we have like a set procedure that you call in. So it's always like, this is Kyle Warren. Everything's okay. So you get all that information up front. And then comes the gossip from camp. So...
Okay, we're going to wrap this up. Just a final comment. Canoe tripping has, basically since the origination of Pathfinder, been the lifeblood of Pathfinder. And the in-camp program, a vibrant, energetic in-camp program, supports what canoe tripping is all about, but also addresses needs of some kids who maybe aren't as inclined to canoe trip. But this is a canoe tripping camp. This is a historic event to have this assemblage of directors of tripping. So I want to thank you for your attendance. It's 4 o'clock. I think 4:45, if I remember, is the next call to come up here. So until then, this is rest hour. Okay, so all right, take care.